Our next speaker needs no introduction, because it's me. Thanks, guys. I think everyone's leaving. That's cool. My name's Elizabeth. So I'm a typographer, and I generally deal mostly in the kind of design space, and I didn't really get into art direction or really think much about photography until I started working at an agency about 5 years ago that had a lot of fashion clients, and I realized that there was a huge learning curve, and that my ignorance of photography, specifically fashion photography, was really putting me at a disadvantage. So I started kind of studying it in earnest, and ever since then have become really interested in fashion in general and how it's documented and how these images are made. So type and couture is a talk about the way that we've used both type and fashion to express how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others and how we feel about seeing and being seen. Because type and fashion both can be really intimate arts when you view them through this lens. Typography informs and expresses, but it's mostly literal, while fashion is more nebulous. The interpretations are broader. Fashion is about image, perception, hyper self-awareness, and fashion communicates lifestyles or the aspirations of life visually. In an interview with Lester Bangs, the writer and punk musician Richard Hell once said, "If you invent yourself, you love yourself. The idea of inventing yourself is creating the most ideal image you could imagine." And fashion is about self-invention and self-expression, the secure and insecure ways that we reflect ourselves to ourselves and to others. It's why we can mock it and revere it for its seriousness about itself. Fashion can be really obtuse. But it also has the ability to help somebody understand who they are to the rest of the world. And it was funny when I started working on this talk, because a lot of people kind of snarked about my topic saying, are you just going to throw shade at the type in fashion or whatever? Because there's a lot of careless type in fashion. It can be disappointing in how it often doesn't feel smart about type. Its emphasis on image has often relegated type to this awkward place. It's clunky, obtuse, and kind of the opposite of the photography, which is diligently crafted and directed. And the type that accompanies those images are often really completely ignorant or just not thought of at all. And in making these fashion images, people use the same words over and over again. Feminine, beautiful, delicate, decadent. And there is a parallel with type. Creative and art directors, not to mention clients, request type that is beautiful, delicate, feminine. And I've always had to pause to figure out what that actually means, because 95% of the time, those descriptors are describing a high contrast modern serif. It's usually describing Didons, Dido or Bodoni or something of that ilk. But it's usually one of those, and I can't ever recall somebody specifying which Dido or which Bodoni, because being specific about type and its qualities makes art directors nervous. I don't know why. Maybe it's because typographers have a reputation of making that a contentious conversation, and maybe we should work on that, guys. Anyway, those descriptors can be problematic, not because those words and femininity are bad, but because it becomes the only way we can describe things to and about women. For example, I don't like the word sexy when it's used to describe type, any more than I like the word delicious to describe anything that isn't food. It's just creepy. I'm digressing. So I began with this simple thesis to determine where and why and how didones became so prevalent in fashion and who initiated this. It wasn't these dudes. Somewhere along the way, high contrast didones, amongst other things, became the primary typographic language to denote fashion. So I started at where I thought it might have originated. Vogue. In the beginning, there was Vogue. This is its first issue from 1892. Haute couture itself was implemented in Paris in 1858, nearly 40 years prior by the Englishman Charles Frederick Worth. Haute couture is high-end fashion that is constructed by hand from start to finish, made from high-quality, expensive, and often unusual fabric, and it's sewn with extreme attention to detail and finished by the most experienced and capable sewers. Vogue's purpose at its inception was to celebrate the ceremonial side of life, which is to say that it was for American aristocrats and the shit that they were interested in. When I started this research, I quickly noticed that the typography was much more complex than what I'd assumed. Here we see this interlocking O and G, no images on this cover, from 1907. And here's some weird loopy lettering from 1911 on an editorial spread. And you can also see these two didon V's used as a kind of ornament behind the ladies. This is just prior to the arrival of the editor Edna Woolman Chase, who manned the editorial helm at Vogue from 1914 to 1951. Here's a very deco cover from 1924. And more deco 5 years later. This is from 1929. This is the year that M.F. Aga, a Russian-born Turk, became the art director of Vogue. Condé Nast had met Aga in Europe. He was the art director then of Vogue Berlin, and he became fascinated by the man and his overt process about how to make a magazine. Aga believed that art direction was not purely ornament, but an essential part of how a magazine should be built, its foundation. This marked a change. Design was no longer regarded as a decorative adjunct or as gifted mechanical skill, but as an organic function of the modern publication. Aga also brought with him the geometric sans serifs that were the prevailing fashion in Europe. He introduced a lot of the modernist sensibilities of the Deco period from Europe, and these spreads are from the heart of that time, 1933 and 1934. These typefaces were largely unused in the States. And I'm not sure for certain how these typefaces might have gotten here. Either trays of them were brought over on steamships, which is an excellent thought, or knockoffs were made or electroformed at some stage. I still don't know how they would have done that without the originals. So Aga was responsible for what's called a purified typographic style. This is from 1939, and we discover this lovely condensed script in the beginning of a real time of experimentation with the Vogue logo. The covers from this point were all illustrated by different illustrators who would take over the issue's tone of voice or sense of humor, like Instagram takeovers, but without the bullshit in the sense that your life is all wrong. This is another from 1939. And another. You can see the freedom and the autonomy that was given to those they commissioned to draw the covers. The variation continues throughout this period, but they didn't seem to have a problem repeating styles of lettering they liked either. So it wasn't like they were just trying to completely redo something every issue. If they liked something, they would bring it back. If they wanted to throw something out, they would. This is quite similar to the previous issue, but painted with a thicker brush. You can kind of see the difference. This is my least favorite. I don't know why. I love Benito's illustrations. He did a lot of these covers, but this one seems like a Matisse hack, which is a good time to point out that fashion is all about appropriation and straight-up theft. Fashion begets fashion, style begets style, and we'll see examples of this throughout these images. This is another from 1939, demonstrating how much experimentation was actually going on and what was being tried. This is all build up a buildup of a typographic style for fashion, but none of this really established anything yet. So here's that condensed script again from 6 issues prior. And this one has such a great drop shadow, which is a hard thing to be great at. The typographic shadow mimics the hard shadow of the foliage that's not even in the frame. The variation of style makes these issues feel special and collectible. And at this point, Vogue was coming out twice per month, so this was clearly a lot of work. This is a Dali cover, no big deal. Clear indication that fashion was intertwined with culture and art, and it was unafraid to make these connections. And in fact, it does establish fashion as a high art. It created a direct parallel for itself, which is another thing fashion does. It injects itself where you least expect it. Along with that element of surprise and its ability to create these hostile takeovers of one's lifestyle is its craftsmanship, and all of that combined does indeed qualify fashion as a fine art. Here's another total departure with so much detail and a real experimentation with vivid color. And hearkening back again to those condensed scripts from the beginning of the year. This is all still 1939, by the way. Another similar style. And this is one of the most unusual ones yet. I love the colors and the composition of this one, and this weird Tuscan-esque diamond slicing the word in half. And then, chuck it behind a chain link fence. Sure, why not? It's 1939, anything goes. And back to another interpretation of these forms, but painted again with a different brush to integrate with the rest of the painting. So I thought that was really interesting that the logo is not treated in any of these instances like it's slapped on, like it's a separate thing. These are all treated as one composition. And another quite beautiful departure. So if I had shown you this in isolation, this would just look like a great classic fashion magazine cover, but knowing now what we do about previous covers, it's astonishing that the style changed so dramatically and that photography, illustration, and painting were freely used interchangeably without any care to what we now call branding. Because, of course, with the next issue, mid-October of 1939, we come back to this style. But then let's abandon all of that precedent and go into a full bifurcated, super ornamented Tuscan logo spanning the width of the cover using this amazing compositional photography. For the Christmas Gifts issue of 1939, the excellent C.P. Pinellas constructed the Vogue logo out of fine jewelry. By the way, Debbie Millman just did a book on C.P.'s recipes that was designed by Roberto De Vic. It looks amazing. Check it out. And so now for 1940. At this point in my research, it was safe to say that my thesis about the typographic language of fashion seemed naively shallow. The complexity and the daring of these logos and covers up to this point stand in such stark contrast to how we think of fashion magazines today. This particular compressed square logo seems to come straight out of 1940's, most fashionable trend, which was fascism. So I'll flip through several covers from 1940 so you can see that this experimentation really doesn't let up during this time. Sure, stencil, wartime. Human letters, this is one of my favorites. Like, how did they even come up with this? This is by the aforementioned Eduardo Garcia Benito, who illustrated tons of Vogue covers from the 20s on. So in August of 1940, we see this fat-faced Didon appear, and we're starting to see maybe where the impetus for these began for a logo. This is 2 weeks later, some experimentation with letter spacing. And the next issue, we're back to compressed. Can you imagine the office politics that would happen today if this kind of change happened twice a month? And this was analog. So 1 year after the CP cover, the Christmas Gifts cover of 1940 brings us something quite similar to what we are now used to thinking of with Vogue. And the next month, in January of 1941, Vogue and America are at war. Very serious. But it's still fashion, and now it's summer, so let's brighten it up. This is also just amazing. This one. So skipping ahead a few years, the interior spreads were noticeably adopting the high contrast detones, for sure for copy, if not further experimentation with the logo on the contents page. How gorgeous is that G? So what else was happening? And was this unique? So Carmel Snow was an editor at Vogue who went over to Bazaar and was responsible for the hiring of Alexei Brodovich, another Russian art director. He began his career at Harper's Bazaar in 1834 and stayed there for 24 years. Bazaar literally means a mixture of styles, which was pretty apropos for a modernist vision that blended the art of clothing with photography, art, and music. Taking the principles of Vogue that celebrated strong photography, illustration, and typography, Snow also hired the photographer Martin Munkaski, I never know how to say his name, and the illustrator Erte. There's a clear sensibility for typography and composition for Brodovich. Specifically, he uses scale and typographic color to guide these kind of constructivist, modernist principles. Some of these finds were of sketches, which I was really happy about. It makes you wonder how we will understand the creative process now when we don't have these physical sheets of sketches and revisions. But it really helps to understand how these designers thought about space and foreground and background. Among the photographers that Brodovich hired were European artists like Man Ray. This established a precedent for typography to follow the lead of the photography, which was basically the best way to get photographers to trust him. Prior to this, and even today, there's a fear of how typography will interact with photography because it so often impedes both. They get in each other's way. So what seems like an effortless gesture of one following the other is in fact carefully crafted. That it occurred in somewhat of a system in following a visual language is pretty remarkable. So these major scale changes really played with the ability of typography to create drama. The typography forces you to notice the figure. If the type here just lived in straight columns, would we notice the sharp angle of the pose? Which is to say that the photography and the typography are codependent in these in good layouts. I included this one because I love looking at images of Penelope Tree. She's such an odd, captivating woman to look at. So again, this vertical New York makes you understand how bold the foreground is of the photograph, even though the depth of field is focused on the car in the background. Here's an example of how type and space and image were all married on a front cover. I love how he looked at the very graphic nature of the double A's and used it to the advantage of the photograph. Richard Avedon was another photographer whose sculptural compositions suited Brodovich's typography entirely. We look at these figures, these women and their shapes, and it's no wonder that we use words like feminine and graceful and elegant and beautiful when we describe typography that we want to emulate and support fashion. Brodovich was succeeded by Henry Wolff in 1957, and the magazine's reputation for unique type and art direction was maintained. Skipping forward to 1992 brings us to Fabien Baron, a designer and art director who's arguably the most famous modern day example of someone who extended and expanded the visual language that fashion has articulated. Born in Paris to an art director father, Baron grew up in publishing, and like so many great stories, he came to New York with next to nothing, and through talent, persistence, and being a white male, rose to the top of editorial design. Fabien Baron's work is almost all in unique reverence to the typographic traditions of fashion we've just covered. His work at Harper's Bazaar, and these are from Interview magazine, involved making Dito even more sculptural. This is Interview. So this overlapping of the thin strokes of type extended into sans serifs for beauty branding and packaging, which I won't go into too much. We could extend this into beauty, but it does have its kind of separate visual niche, even though there's some overlap there. And finally, Futura joins this language. Now might be a good time to talk about Futura, or derivative geometric sans of that sort. Futura has coexisted with the Didons in fashion typography since the beginning. You'll remember this one from 1929 and these interior spreads. And these were other titles going way back to, this is actually from a book that Steve Heller put together. This is Vogue in the 80s, rocking almost all Futura at this point, aside from the logotype. Elle magazine launched way back in 1945 in France, but when it launched in the US in 1975, it launched with Futura. When I interviewed Elle's former design director, Evan Campisi, he described the magazine as an indie magazine coming to mainstream fashion magazines. He said it's decidedly unladylike compared to your classic upmarket Upper East Side set. And Futura claims the voice of downtown fashion and culture. In fact, it's transcended just Futura and moved clearly into grotesque territory. Because Dito, in the minds of younger magazines and their audiences, feels like the old definition of luxury. Street style has risen to prominence, and collections are now tribes. Prominent fashion designers now originally made their names in minimalism or street style. So they kind of divorced themselves from that old visual language. Evan describes the use of geometric sans as integral to Elle being faster, big, and bold. And it's strategic because it's consciously designed for social engagement. What looks good Instagrammed? What feels youthful? Futura, Evan told me, feels fit. And no, this isn't specifically Futura. This was a derivative custom commission, but its purposes in the fashion world are the same as Futura's purposes. It has become a language of its own. And so our treatment of fashion type in fashion magazines reflects and is reflected by the brands, or labels as they're called in fashion. This is more Fabien Baron for the CFDA, which is the big fashion organization mostly to blame for Fashion Week. So haute couture, which essentially means bespoke and tailored high-end clothing, was implemented in Paris by Charles Frederick Worth. Coco Chanel opened her shop with haute couture in 1919, and we consider her to be truly the impetus for haute couture. But we have to back up 1 second, because we have to acknowledge that long before Coco Chanel opened up her shop on Rue Cambon, Hermès opened way back in 1837, and Louis Vuitton in 1854. But these were not clothing stores. They were fancy leather goods, bags, trunks, luggage, saddles, and more. The interesting thing about this is that leather goods required an actual physical brand. to mark their wares. So it made sense that a logo like this, reminiscent of a metalsmith's or potter's hallmark, would take shape. But Coco Chanel made dresses and coats and shirts, not leather goods. But still, she must have wanted to adopt the language of the high-end leather goods, perhaps because they paired so well with her clothing. This logo has never been changed, and it's almost 100 years old. So just 2 years later, in 1921, Gucci, the perfect name for a shoe villain, if there ever was one, opened his shop of fine leather goods in Florence. Shoes and handbags run nearly concurrently with dressmaking and expert tailoring. I mean, I love those G's. I would have just kept those, but this was his logo. It's been tweaked a bit since then, but just kind of to this. So this is where it comes from the beginnings of couture, really. There was a precedent for appropriation, or even just an utmost faith in the precedent. The reasons behind the decisions don't satisfy our graphic design minds, which want to problem solve for a label because of all of the tonal opportunities a fashion label presents. It's so expressive, and yet the type is very much derivative. So fashion, like all art, is a leap. It requires an enormous enormous outpouring of money and materials and creativity and resources, all with the hope that someone will spend a lot of money on it so that makers can recoup their costs. So while they must take their chances with their creative visions in order to succeed, they don't dare extend that to the brand's graphic identity. My friend Nick, who's the art director at Interview, had some good insight into this, that voice needs to tell you that you can spend that money because this clothing is like Chanel or it's like Louis Vuitton. So between the 1920s and 1950s in Paris, the labels we most associate with high fashion were born. Hermès, Louis Vuitton, Lanvin, Balmain, Chanel, Gucci, Givenchy, R.I.P., he just died 2 weeks ago, Givenchy, Christian Dior, and Balenciaga. These labels formed the nexus of Parisian haute couture in its golden age, and their visual identities were of a decided language. So strong were these that the new designers of in the 50s onward who contributed to haute couture also emulated these marks. Yves Saint Laurent took over designing for Christian Dior in 1957, but when it came time to design his own label, he looked to the existing visual language, as did Diane van Furstenberg in the 1970s. Admittedly, it's really ugly, but she was trying to capture the same spirit, I guess. So now, clearly borrowing from both brands and fashion editorial, Italian labels such as Pucci in the late 40s, MISSONI, founded in 1953, and Armani in 1975, realized that no one was deviating from this visual language. It should be noted that not all of these are the original logos, but they certainly did all play with this typographic restraint at some point, though MISSONI is a real departure with this lower contrast Egyptian. I mean, it's not a science. The newer guard of designers maintained the language, like Valentino and Ralph Lauren. Calvin Klein in 1968, Dolce & Gabbana in 1985. This is actually Calvin Klein's new logo in the middle here. So notably, with the melding of downtown fashion here to stay, when Saint Laurent rebranded post-Yves, they used Helvetica. To me, this signifies a permanence to the notion that downtown fashion is as valuable as uptown fashion. Stylistically and perhaps philosophically, there's a difference between Yves Saint Laurent and Saint Laurent. The transition within the label makes total sense, though. Yves was known for capturing a daring and an edge and a beauty simultaneously, and Saint Laurent has adapted to our time in a perfect emulation of that spirit. And seeing this kind of leap is super exciting, and it makes things like Tom Ford's logo also make sense. Tom Ford became the creative director for Gucci in 1995, elevating the fashion house again after its brand became oversaturated. In the 80s, they kind of went licensing crazy and kind of devalued a lot of their status as brands. So while Ford is known for kind of ultimate sex and luxury, he's parked his logo in the camp of downtown, of new and innovative, of young but not immature, of beauty over youth. So it was kind of funny to me to see that Karl Lagerfeld branded himself like this post-Tom Ford. Lagerfeld has been the creative director of Chanel since 1983 and Fendi since 1985. But when it came time to rebrand himself, he joined the side of the downtown edge, which can only be expected from a man that dapper who sports a white ponytail. That's a wink at Mr. Carter, by the way. What can be determined from these grotesque choices? Essentially, that the visual language of fashion has to be born from a maverick. No one is taking chances. But if one does make that jump and it's accepted, it's because the designer has gained an unprecedented level of respect early on, or it originates from a voice in the industry you'd be stupid to question. Either way, if you pull it off, 75 other houses will adopt what you've declared your own. Which brings us to how these labels are used graphically. Fashion was the first industry to understand that the value of its products could become synonymous and later be outvalued by the presence of the brand itself. I love this image because it's a diagram for spotting an authentic Louis Vuitton bag. Every little detail, it's authenticity that matters, more than the fact that people might really like that bag or that it matches a good part of their wardrobe or it's practical. Its authenticity has to do with its brand. Louis Vuitton started out this way for proprietary reasons as a leather goods house, but the status of ownership helped form a new kind of aristocracy, one for which the other aspects of the product became secondary. The interesting part to people about this bag is how the L and the V are appropriated in a new way, and that it's authentically Louis Vuitton and therefore has value. All the other details are secondary. And the evolution or interpretation of the brand mark becomes the focus of the bag. So this is actually a great segue. Louis Vuitton established that tactic, and it was soon followed by many a label. This is Marc Jacobs, who was the creative director at Louis Vuitton from 1997 to 2014, extrapolating what he learned about the value of something being Louis Vuitton. It's an idea that was inspired by Stephen Sprouse, who was responsible for this outfit many years earlier, and then whom Marc Jacobs asked later on to collaborate with. Marc Jacobs did a kind of graffiti over his own label, proving our suspicions that what we really want is the label itself. He did this collaboration with Sprouse in 2001. This is the photographer David Hughes for Louis Vuitton, taking this idea and running with it. The branding of Louis Vuitton becomes distorted and purposely vandalized and repurposed into a figure, all of which we see before we even really notice the product. So Louis Vuitton's willingness to create graphic forms out of their logo in order to reflect the luxury it claims to be has since led loads of designers to experiment with their logos graphically. This is Fendi. Fendi. And the following are all ways that Karl Lagerfeld tried to exploit the Chanel logo. A chainsaw, a hair clip, this like Lego bag. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Tennis racket, surfboard, beach balls, etc. But all of that doesn't really count as clothing per se. Those are examples of how type is graphic, and graphics can represent class and exclusivity. Moschino, the label, was founded in 1983 by Franco Moschino, who sought to, quote, disrupt the value system and bourgeois affectations of elitist fashion, using Dada and pop art as his weapons of choice. Pop art, with its tongue-in-cheek immaturity, inflatable swim toys, and blaring colors, comic type and all, was then transferred onto clothing as an extension of the art movement. Moschino has always toyed with the graphic nature of large-scale mainstream branding. By subverting these common graphics, injecting them into high-end women's wear, conversations are started about our value systems themselves. This is Linda Evangelista, looking very Upper East Side, holding this very Chanel-looking bag that has a McDonald's logo on it. This raincoat is by the artist Mimi Smith. Emulating plastic packaging as a plastic raincoat becomes a pretty loaded topic about the environment. This is a corset made by Christine Lofazo. Corsets themselves have contentious histories. How does that context change, alter what the text says? The truth is the marriage of type on clothing will always elevate the other's meaning. What does type mean once it's clothing someone? And what does clothing mean when it's suddenly saying something? Aptly, a book published by the Met Costume Institute entitled Wardrobe opens with this quote, "On the breast of her gown, in red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. A letter on a body signifies something." So it's pretty natural for artists to play with this notion, how clothing expresses what's on the inside and how type is the most literal way to express what that expression is. In this same paper vein, the dress on the left was a gimmick to subscribe to the Echo newspaper in 1893, and on the right is a paper dress made to emulate the Yellow Pages around 1967. This print was designed by Elsa Schiaparelli, a designer from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and whose work was shown in parallel with Muccia Prada's at the Costume Institute a few years ago. It was an amazing show. This is called Ration Coupon, and you can kind of see these little numbers interspersed as background texture. Those little numbers are a graphic language of wartime ration coupons, of course dating between 1940 and 1945. Schiaparelli had also designed a cellophane belt in 1936 that could be ordered with your name and phone number written on it as the ultimate expression of personal identity. But they're not all politically charged statements. I love this piece because it subverts the dress dummy itself, printing the utilitarian branding on it and everything. Some very personal feeling French handwriting used as concrete poetry. Some of these pieces are just art, and the letters are just familiar graphic shapes. This is a detail of a print in the dress by Nettie Rosenstein from 1945. This is an unknown label, it's French from the 20s, called Alphabet Lace Dress, and they attribute it to concrete poetry in the book because it means nothing. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was conceptual. Letters just make interesting shapes and patterns sometimes. This is a 90s version in ultra suede, naturally. This is actually a Parsons student project, which was to use a found object. I'm not sure which part of this was found or what. Just some similar graphic pieces. What's it say? French jacket. These are new, pretty new pieces, actually. I'll leave you with this one. This is my favorite of the many images I dug through in terms of its reverence for letters. The curator of Wardrobe writes, "Brilliantly of the pop art movement, but also the quaintly of the plantain type specimen and commercial copy past. This outfit that covers the body in letters seizes the initiative of the pop sensibility without sacrificing abstraction, achieved through all-over design. Gernreich equivocated here between the tabloid elements of pop and turn-of-the-century uses of typefaces and lettering as rudimentary graphic art. A letter is an inescapable and unambiguous sign, meant to be understood in one way and not in another, but the appearance of letters out of order and repeated ensuite on a garment renders the unequivocal letter as something curiously unfixed and uncertain. No, this guy just saw like a photo lettering type specimen and went, wow, that's beautiful. I'm going to make that into a dress. Thank you very much, by the way, to Christian Schwartz, who lent me this typeface Le Jeune for these slides and offered some invaluable information about the world of editorial fashion type. Evan Campisi from L, Nick Lem, and many others who made this possible, including Jessica Pressler at the Met Costume Institute and the librarians at FIT. I researched this stuff for quite a long time, but mostly thank you to my fashion muse, Francesca.